For most of my professional life, I was trained to look for answers in charts, scans, lab values, and clinical trials. I learned to trust numbers, to respect protocols, and to believe that if something mattered, it would eventually show up in peer-reviewed literature. And yet, as the years passed and my patients grew older alongside me, I began to realize that some of the most meaningful truths about health never appear on a monitor or in a file. They surface quietly, often accidentally, in moments of trust. They emerge not when a patient is being examined, but when they are being heard. There is a particular shift that happens when people reach later stages of life. The urgency to impress fades. The need to explain oneself weakens. What remains is a kind of honesty that is both raw and gentle. In that space, many seniors begin to talk about the small things they do when no one is watching. Not because they think these things are important, but because they are simply part of how they live. At first, these conversations felt anecdotal, even charming. Over time, they became impossible to ignore. I began to notice that certain individuals aged remarkably well, not just in appearance, but in presence. Their minds were alert, their movements were confident, their emotional tone was steady, and when I listened carefully, I realized they were not necessarily following mainstream medical advice more closely than others. Instead, they were responding to their bodies with curiosity. They were experimenting, adjusting, listening. In a way, they had become quiet scientists of their own lives. One of the most striking realizations for me was how deeply the human body responds to rhythm. Not just circadian rhythm in the clinical sense, but the rhythms of daily living. Light and dark, activity and rest, warmth and cold, feeding and fasting. These cycles are ancient, written into our biology long before we had names for hormones or neurotransmitters. When people age, many instinctively return to these rhythms, not out of rebellion, but out of comfort. And science, slowly and sometimes reluctantly, has begun to confirm why this matters. Take something as simple as exposure to cold. For decades, discomfort was seen as something to avoid, especially in older adults. And yet, controlled cold exposure activates systems that remain dormant in modern life. It stimulates adaptive stress responses, increases metabolic efficiency, and influences neurotransmitters involved in mood and alertness. What fascinated me was not just the physiology, but the mindset of the seniors who practiced it. They didn't describe it as punishment. They described it as awakening. A brief, intentional challenge that reminded them their bodies were still capable of responding, adapting, and regulating themselves. This idea of gentle challenge comes up again and again. The human body does not thrive on ease alone. It thrives on meaningful stress, followed by recovery. Muscles strengthen through resistance. Bones remodel under load. The brain rewires itself when faced with novelty. Many older adults, without ever using scientific language, seem to understand this intuitively. They introduce small forms of difficulty into their routines, not to suffer, but to stay engaged with life. Food is another area where intuition often precedes theory. Long before fasting became a trend, many seniors naturally spaced their meals further apart. They ate when they were hungry and stopped when they were satisfied. They noticed that late-night eating disrupted their sleep and digestion, so they adjusted. What we now understand is that the body uses periods without food to repair itself at a cellular level. Energy that would otherwise be spent on digestion is redirected toward maintenance, recycling damaged components, and restoring balance. This process becomes increasingly important with age, yet it cannot occur if the body is constantly in a fed state. What I find most compelling is that these eating patterns are rarely driven by restriction. They are driven by comfort. Seniors often say, "I just feel better this way." And that feeling is data. It reflects changes in insulin signaling, inflammation, and nervous system balance that no single blood test can fully capture. Rest, too, takes on a different meaning later in life. The cultural obsession with constant productivity fades, and the body begins to assert its need for pauses. Short, intentional naps are a perfect example. When timed well, they support memory consolidation, cardiovascular health, and emotional regulation. The brain is not designed to remain at peak alertness all day. It needs moments of withdrawal, of reduced input, where neural networks can reset. Seniors who honor this need often report clearer thinking and more stable energy than those who push through fatigue. Movement, however, never loses its importance. What changes is the form it takes. Many older adults move not for performance, but for pleasure. Dancing alone in a living room may look trivial, but neurologically, it is extraordinarily rich. Music activates emotional memory. Movement engages motor planning, balance, and coordination. Together, they create a full brain experience that few structured exercises can replicate. When people dance to music tied to meaningful periods of their lives, they are not just exercising muscles. They are reinforcing identity. They are reminding the brain who they are. This connection between identity and health is something medicine has historically struggled to measure. Yet it may be one of the most powerful forces in aging. Seniors who maintain a sense of self, who engage in practices that feel personally meaningful, tend to show greater resilience in the face of physical decline. Writing, for example, is often dismissed as a hobby, but handwriting engages sensory motor and emotional circuits simultaneously. When seniors write letters they never intend to send, they are not communicating outward. They are organizing their inner world. They are integrating memory, emotion, and meaning in a way that reduces psychological load and supports physiological calm. The nervous system is deeply influenced by perceived safety. When the mind feels settled, the body follows. Practices that slow thought, ground attention, and provide emotional expression activate the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system, which governs repair, digestion, and immune function. This is not abstract theory. It is observable in heart rate variability, cortisol levels, and sleep architecture. Seniors who find ways to regularly access this state often appear younger than their chronological age. Another subtle but profound practice is self-talk. Speaking out loud, narrating actions, or addressing oneself by name may seem odd, but it recruits language centers that reinforce executive function. It externalizes thought, making it easier to organize, remember, and regulate emotion. From a neurological perspective, it strengthens connections between regions responsible for planning, memory, and emotional control. From a human perspective, it provides companionship in moments of solitude. And loneliness, as we now know, is not just an emotional state. It is a biological stressor with measurable effects on health. Nutrition, too, extends beyond calories and macronutrients. The compounds found in herbs and spices interact with inflammatory pathways, antioxidant systems, and even gene expression. When seniors combine spices thoughtfully, they are engaging in a form of nutritional synergy. These compounds often work best together, enhancing absorption and amplifying effect. What matters here is not just the chemistry, but the intention. Preparing food with care, attention, and curiosity transforms eating into an act of participation rather than consumption. Sunlight is another example of something both simple and complex. Light exposure influences vitamin synthesis, hormone regulation, immune function, and circadian alignment. Moderate, intentional exposure supports systems that supplements can only partially replace. Seniors who seek the sun often do so not out of defiance, but out of intuition. They feel its effect on mood, sleep, and vitality. Science has since revealed mechanisms involving nitric oxide release, melatonin timing, and immune modulation that help explain these experiences. Some practices appear unusual until we consider the body as an integrated system. Oral health, for instance, is deeply connected to systemic inflammation. Reducing harmful bacteria in the mouth can influence cardiovascular risk, joint health, and immune burden. Simple daily rituals that support this balance can have effects far beyond the gums. The mouth is not separate from the body. It is an entry point, a signaling hub, and a mirror of internal health. Movement that challenges orientation, such as walking backwards, illustrates how the brain thrives on novelty. When familiar patterns are disrupted, neural circuits must adapt. This stimulates regions involved in balance, spatial awareness, and executive control. It is not the distance or speed that matters, but the demand placed on perception and coordination. Seniors who introduce these challenges are, in effect, cross-training their brains. Perhaps the most powerful practice I have observed is the pursuit of learning for its own sake. Not learning to be productive, but learning to be stretched. When adults take on skills completely unrelated to their past identities, they force the brain into unfamiliar territory. This activates plasticity mechanisms that remain available throughout life, though they require effort to engage. The discomfort of being a beginner is not a sign of decline. It is a sign of growth. What unites all of these behaviors is not rebellion against medicine, but curiosity about the self. Seniors who age well tend to see their bodies not as machines that are breaking down, but as systems that are still communicating. They listen. They respond. They experiment gently and observe honestly. In doing so, they reclaim a sense of agency that is often lost in clinical settings. As a physician, this has changed how I understand health. It is not merely the absence of disease. It is the presence of engagement. Engagement with sensation, with memory, with challenge, with rest. The human body is remarkably adaptive when given the right signals. Those signals do not always come from prescriptions or procedures. Sometimes they come from rituals, from habits that feel small but are practiced consistently. Aging, then, is not simply a process of loss. It is a shift in priorities. What falls away is excess. What remains is essence. Seniors who thrive tend to honor this shift. They choose practices that nourish rather than impress, that stabilize rather than stimulate. And in doing so, they reveal something profound about human health, that longevity is not just about adding years to life, but about adding life to years through attention, curiosity, and compassion toward one's own body. When I listen now, I listen differently. I listen not just for symptoms, but for patterns. Not just for compliance, but for intuition. And again, I am reminded that the human body, even late in life, is not finished speaking. It is still teaching us, quietly, patiently, waiting for us to pay attention.